At the height of the Roman Republic, when Rome's power stretched from the mountains of northern Hispania to the ancient cities along the coasts of Asia Minor, the known world seemed to bow before the imposing shadow of the legions. It was an era in which the Senate proclaimed new conquests almost every year, and military victories followed one another so frequently that for many citizens they had become part of the everyday landscape. Yet, beneath this facade of absolute grandeur, Rome was mired in a profound political crisis, a maelstrom of personal ambitions, fragile alliances, and social tensions that threatened to open irreparable fissures in the very fabric of the Republic. In that turbulent context, three colossal figures emerged as the true masters of Roman destiny. They were men whose influence far surpassed that of any magistrate or senator, and whose mere presence was enough to tip the scales of power. These three protagonists, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, had forged a secret pact designed to secure their absolute control over Roman politics. This agreement, later known as the First Triumvirate, completely transformed the internal dynamics of the state and established such a delicate balance that any misstep could trigger a catastrophe. Pompey, victorious in the east and hailed as one of the greatest generals of his time, enjoyed the favor of the people and the respect of the troops. Caesar, charismatic and audacious, continued to amass spectacular victories in Gaul, where his campaigns were rapidly expanding Rome's borders. And finally, Crassus, whose wealth surpassed that of any other living Roman citizen, provided the pact with the economic power necessary to sustain the ambitions of the other two. But while Pompey and Caesar basked in military glory, Crassus suffered from a far more corrosive affliction than envy, the feeling of being left behind in the race for posterity. Despite being the richest man in Rome, owner of mines, rural estates, vast urban lands, and a private army of slaves trained as firefighters, Crassus knew his reputation could not match the prestige Pompey and Caesar had earned on the battlefield. His fortune had grown through tactics many considered dishonorable, buying burned-down buildings for ridiculously low prices and reselling them, destroying political rivals to seize their assets, and using his influence to secure lucrative contracts and privileges. But all that wealth, accumulated over decades, was not enough to grant him what he truly desired: a military legacy that would place him among Rome's greatest conquerors. That desire, that silent but constant obsession, began to shape his every decision. Crassus knew that to equal his allies in the triumvirate, he needed a victory so decisive and resounding that the Senate, the people, and history would place him on the same level as Pompey and Caesar. And to achieve this, he needed a military campaign that was swift, spectacular, and overflowing with plunder. His gaze then turned eastward toward a territory whose wealth was almost legendary among the Romans. The Parthian Empire, heir to the ancient Persian domains and nestled in the fertile lands between the Euphrates and the Indian borders. The Parthians were a nomadic people who had managed to overthrow the last successors of Alexander the Great and establish a powerful and stable state. Under their king, Orodes II, they administered a vast territory, rich in trade, agriculture, and prosperous cities. For Crassus, this nation represented the perfect opportunity, an enemy that, in his view, could not match the discipline of the legions, and a territory that promised untold riches. He imagined oriental treasures, caravans laden with gold and precious stones, temples filled with valuable objects, and markets overflowing with exotic goods. He could already picture himself returning to Rome at the head of a triumphal procession, displaying to all the spoils of a conquered empire. From that moment on, his ambition began to take shape. In 55 BC, Crassus obtained the governorship of the province of Syria, a position that gave him direct access to the Parthian border and, above all, the military authority necessary to launch a campaign without relying on the formal approval of the Senate. Although the augurs declared the omens unfavorable and several magistrates tried to stop him, even resorting to religious threats, Crassus ignored all the warnings. He was convinced that nothing could overshadow the might of the Roman legions. The machine was in motion. When Crassus returned to Syria after his first incursion into Mesopotamian lands, he was more confident than ever. The absence of serious resistance during that initial advance had convinced him that Parthia was an easy target, a territory whose defenses would collapse at the mere presence of the legions. That impression, however, could not have been more wrong. What Crassus interpreted as weakness was, in reality, part of a calculated partisan strategy to avoid any premature clash, to study the invader's movements, and to prepare the ground to confront him at the most opportune moment. While the Roman general rested in Syria for the winter, King Orodes II carefully analyzed Crassus's intentions. The Parthians were not a hastily formed empire. They had spent decades observing Roman tactics and knew their strengths, but also their limitations perfectly. Roman heavy infantry was virtually unbeatable in close formation, but its mobility was limited, and its ability to fight in open terrain was compromised when they had to pursue or respond to swift cavalry attacks. Orodes understood that defeating Crassus would not require matching the number of Roman troops, but rather exploiting the speed and flexibility of his army. Therefore, he decided to divide his forces. He himself marched to Armenia to confront King Artavasdes, who had promised aid to the Romans and represented a strategic risk. Meanwhile, the defense against Crassus's advance was entrusted to a young but already celebrated general, the Parthian nobleman Surena, a commander whose reputation grew with each campaign. Although barely over 30, Surena had proven himself a brilliant strategist, an expert in swift maneuvers and the offensive and defensive use of cavalry. His presence commanded respect. He belonged to one of the oldest families in the empire and had the hereditary privilege of crowning new Parthian kings, an honor reserved only for the most prestigious lineages. The army Surena assembled was small in number compared to the Roman forces, but it was composed of highly specialized troops who mastered a style of warfare entirely different from the Roman one. Its core consisted of approximately 9,000 mounted archers, horsemen capable of firing accurately even at high speed, trained to attack from a distance and withdraw before becoming trapped in close combat. They were joined by about 1,000 cataphracts, warriors armored from head to toe and mounted on horses similarly protected by metal armor. This combination allowed for a perfect balance between mobility and shock power, something Crassus neither understood nor took seriously. When spring arrived in 53 BC, Crassus crossed the Euphrates again. This time he had no intention of turning back until he had achieved a complete victory. His army was formidable: 7 legions of heavy infantry, thousands of auxiliaries, and a large cavalry force composed of Gauls, Thracians, and other allied communities. Among the officers accompanying him was his son Publius, a young and courageous commander who had already distinguished himself under Julius Caesar in Gaul. To many soldiers, Publius represented the enthusiasm and energy of youth. To Crassus, he was also a living reminder of the lineage and legacy he hoped to solidify through this campaign. However, from the very beginning, disagreements arose between Crassus and his own eastern allies. King Artavasdes of Armenia offered him military support, promising to send a cavalry contingent and advising him to advance into Parthian territory through the mountains, a longer but also much safer route. The mountains would have limited the mobility of the enemy cavalry and forced the Parthians to fight on unfavorable terrain. But Crassus rejected this recommendation. His pride, impatience, and a false sense of superiority led him to discard a sensible strategic plan and opt for the most direct route, the flat desert road. This decision would determine his fate. As soon as Crassus began to venture into the open region east of the Euphrates, he received a visit from a figure who would decisively influence what was about to happen. Ariamnes, an Arab who feigned sympathy for Rome but who, in reality, worked for Sureina. With calculated words, Ariamnes convinced Crassus that the Parthians were fleeing in terror, scattering across the desert without a clear strategy. He assured him that if they advanced quickly, they could overtake and destroy them before they could regroup. Crassus, eager for a swift victory, believed every word. From that moment on, the Roman army began a rapid march across unfamiliar terrain. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, the wind whipped up clouds of dust, and the column grew ever longer. The scouts Crassus sent out ventured too far and often failed to return, causing unease among the more experienced officers. But every warning was ignored. Crassus, fueled by the delusion of Ariamnes, was convinced that victory lay right before him. Sureina, meanwhile, observed everything from a distance. There was no need to rush. Her strategy was to lure the Roman army into a vast, open terrain devoid of natural cover, a scenario where the Parthian cavalry would have a decisive advantage. Her aim was not to attack immediately, but to wear the Romans down physically and psychologically, to push them to their limits before revealing her true strength. And so, with every step Crassus's army took, the scene of tragedy drew ever closer. As Crassus's army advanced across the arid Mesopotamian desert, tension mounted among the Roman officers. The legions marched in heavy armor under a blazing sun. The scarcity of water was beginning to affect the men's morale and stamina, and the pack animals suffered as much as the soldiers. With each passing day, it became clearer that the terrain was not neutral. It was a silent adversary working in Sureina's favor. The dunes, valleys, and sparse oases formed a natural labyrinth that weakened the cohesion of the Roman columns and turned every movement into a potential risk. The scouts sent by Crassus returned with conflicting reports. Some claimed to have seen the Parthians retreating, while others spoke of dust clouds indicating enemy movements that no one could pinpoint. Crassus, growing increasingly impatient, refused to heed any advice suggesting caution. Arrogance and a thirst for glory blinded him. In his mind, the discipline and strength of his legions would be enough to subdue any adversary, no matter how cunning or strategic. Publius Crassus, in command of the cavalry, remained vigilant. He had served under Caesar and knew well the importance of military intelligence, but his father's influence and the pressure to prove his courage kept him on edge. The Roman cavalry, heavy and with little maneuverability, trudged through the soft sand. Each hour of march increased their fatigue, and the men began to feel the weight not only of their weapons, but also of the blind faith they placed in their commander's strategy. On the horizon, the Parthian army finally appeared. It wasn't a frontal assault, but a demonstration of absolute control of the terrain. Sureina had deployed his mounted archers in wide circles around the Roman advance, while his cataphracts, the fully armored heavy cavalry, remained hidden behind dunes and hills. The archers began firing their arrows with almost mathematical precision, forcing the Romans to raise their shields and form the traditional testudo, the famous defensive tortoise that protected the soldiers, but slowed them down and slowed them down. Parthian arrows, many designed to pierce Roman armor, rained down on the legionaries like a steady shower. Each blow weakened their morale, each wound increased their despair, and each attempt to advance proved futile against the enemy's mobility. The legions, trained for open battles and direct engagements, found themselves powerless against an enemy that avoided frontal confrontation and exploited distance and open terrain to its advantage. Crassus sent scouts to gauge the size of the enemy army, only to find them quickly pursued and eliminated. The reality slowly began to sink in. They couldn't reach the enemy, and the legions were vulnerable on terrain that prevented them from deploying their full potential. Fatigue, heat, and lack of water compounded the terror of an invisible and relentless attack, while the Parthian archers maintained the pressure, attacking tirelessly and retreating before being reached. Finally, in a desperate attempt, Crassus ordered his son Publius to lead a detachment of 4,000 men, composed of Gallic cavalry, archers, and light infantry units, to pursue the Parthians and force a direct engagement. This maneuver was exactly what Surena had anticipated. The cataphracts emerged from their hiding place and attacked with fury, surrounding and crushing the Roman force. The armored horsemen and their horses, covered in metal scales, were virtually invulnerable to attacks from the Roman light infantry and heavy cavalry. The combined strength of the cataphracts and mounted archers turned the pursuit into a deadly trap. Publius Crassus bravely fell into the ambush, but Surena's tactical superiority proved decisive. Publius's men were almost completely annihilated, and only a few managed to escape to tell the tale. News of the disaster reached Crassus, who watched in horror from a distance as his son and his men were destroyed. Impotence and despair gripped the elderly general, while the psychological impact on his troops began to take its toll. Night fell on the battlefield, bringing with it the certainty of defeat. Crassus ordered a retreat to Carrhae, leaving behind thousands of wounded who could not walk. At dawn, the Parthians caught up with them and massacred the remaining survivors. The city of Carrhae became a temporary refuge, but it was completely surrounded and unable to withstand a prolonged siege. Surena, in complete control of the situation, offered to negotiate surrender in exchange for safe passage and the cession of all territory east of the Euphrates. Crassus, suspicious, accepted under pressure from his officers and with no other options. However, the negotiations quickly broke down. A confrontation erupted during the meeting, and Crassus was killed in the ensuing chaos. According to some accounts, the Parthians even poured molten gold into his mouth, a symbolic act reflecting the greed that had characterized his entire life. His head was sent to King Orodes, who was attending a theatrical performance at the time. With Crassus's death, the legions disintegrated, and what remained of his surviving army was scattered, hunted down, and cut down by the enemy. Of the 42,000 men who had crossed the Euphrates with Crassus, only about 10,000 managed to return to Roman territory, while another 10,000 were captured and sent to the most remote regions of the Parthian Empire as prisoners. The legionary standards, the sacred eagles that represented the strength and glory of Rome, were captured and displayed by the Parthians as trophies, symbolizing the humiliation of Roman power. The Battle of Carrhae became one of the most devastating disasters in Roman history. It not only resulted in the loss of thousands of lives and the capture of soldiers and sacred symbols, but it also shattered the mystique of invincibility that had surrounded the legions for centuries. The political and military humiliation had immediate consequences. The first triumvirate fractured with the death of Crassus, and tensions between Pompey and Caesar intensified, sowing the seeds of the civil war that would soon engulf the Republic. Surena, for his part, reached his moment of glory. His military genius had secured an impressive victory, demonstrating that discipline and numbers do not always guarantee victory on the battlefield. However, his fame would be short-lived. The envy and jealousy of King Orodes condemned him to a later execution, a reminder that even the greatest war heroes are subject to the intrigues of their own political world. The Euphrates became the permanent border between Rome and Parthia, a natural boundary that marked the end of Crassus's boundless ambitions and the historical lesson that wealth and power do not guarantee wisdom or success in war. The Battle of Carrhae not only redefined the geopolitical map of the East, but also left a lasting legacy about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of strategy, patience, and knowledge of the terrain. The news of Crassus's defeat and death reached Rome like a blow that shook the very foundations of the Republic. The city, accustomed to hearing tales of glorious victories and military triumphs of its generals, was now confronted with the stark reality that even the most powerful and wealthy men could be defeated with utter devastation. The magnitude of the loss, approximately 20,000 soldiers killed, 10,000 captured, and the humiliation of seeing legionary standards turned into enemy trophies, generated an atmosphere of shock, fear, and dismay among senators, citizens, and the military itself. Rome realized, perhaps for the first time in decades, that it was not invincible. The first triumvirate, that secret alliance between Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, collapsed instantly. Crassus had been, in many ways, the balance of power between the other two men. His wealth, influence, and political maneuvering kept the simmering tensions in check between Pompey, a veteran of Eastern campaigns and author of impressive conquests, and Caesar, whose ambition and military prowess in Gaul were already beginning to inspire both respect and suspicion. With Crassus's death, the balance tipped. Pompey and Caesar, until then cautious allies, became direct competitors for absolute power in Rome. The seeds of civil war had been sown, and the failure at Carrhae acted as a catalyst for a conflict that would soon tear the Republic apart at its foundations. Roman citizens, upon learning the details of the campaign, reacted with indignation and fear. Accounts of Crassus's greed, his insistence on personal glory, and the tragic fate of his son Publius became cautionary tales about the dangers of pride and unchecked ambition. Writers and chroniclers began to record the story with a moralizing tone, emphasizing that wealth and power did not guarantee wisdom or military success. The narrative of the Battle of Carrhae became a kind of tragic myth, a warning to future generations of generals and politicians about the price of arrogance and a lack of strategic prudence. Pompey, aware of Crassus's disappearance as both ally and rival, moved with caution. He knew that Caesar, strengthened by his victories in Gaul, now posed a direct threat to his ambitions. The Republic, divided and vulnerable, began to see political alliances transform into open tensions as senators attempted to contain the growing rivalry between two of Rome's most powerful men. Crassus's death, besides demonstrating that fortune and wealth do not guarantee survival, altered the political and military balance of the entire Italian peninsula and its provinces. For Caesar, Crassus's defeat represented both a risk and an opportunity. On the one hand, the fall of a powerful ally meant the loss of a political and economic shield against the Senate and Pompey. On the other, it opened a path to unhindered prominence in Rome, provided he knew how to maneuver shrewdly and exploit the power vacuum. History was beginning to turn in favor of those who understood that military and political victory were inextricably intertwined. Meanwhile, for the Parthians, the Battle of Carrhae was a triumph that would be etched in the memory of their civilization for generations. Serena's demonstration of strategy, cunning, and mastery of the terrain showed that a well-coordinated army, aware of the enemy's weaknesses, could defeat even the most disciplined and powerful forces of its time. The Euphrates became a symbolic and effective border that marked regional stability for decades, and the display of captured Roman eagles as trophies served to reinforce the prestige and authority of the Parthian Empire in the eyes of its neighbors. However, Serena's glory would be short-lived. King Orodes, jealous of his general's fame, executed him shortly after Carrhae, a reminder that even heroes can fall victim to the internal politics of their own rulers. Even so, the Parthian victory left an indelible lesson. Rome was not invincible, and war, however well organized it might seem, could always be won through strategy, knowledge of the terrain, and well-executed tactics. In Rome, the disaster at Carrhae changed the perception of the legions, which until then had been considered invulnerable fighting machines. Generals began to rethink strategies, to study enemies beyond simple frontal confrontation, and to understand that prudence, military intelligence, and adaptability were as important as brute force and the discipline of their troops. The defeat also had a profound cultural impact. Roman writers, artists, and orators incorporated Crassus's tragedy into speeches, literary works, and moral lessons, ensuring that the memory of Carrhae would serve as a warning for future generations. Ultimately, the story of Crassus's unbridled ambition, the heroic resistance of his men, Surena's tactical mastery, and the Parthian strategic victory solidified into an epic tale. It was a reminder that wealth does not guarantee glory, that arrogance can lead to ruin, and that war is not merely a game of numbers, but a test of intelligence, patience, and respect for the enemy's forces. The Battle of Carrhae became a landmark event, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Rome and the East. A military and political tragedy whose consequences would be felt for decades, and whose legacy would remain in the memory of all those who understood that even the most powerful legions could fall to an ingenious and determined enemy. Carrhae reminds us that history does not forgive arrogance, and that wealth and power do not always guarantee victory. One man's unbridled ambition changed the fate of thousands, shattered alliances, and left a lesson that still resonates today. In war, as in life, prudence and strategy are more valuable than gold. What would have happened if Crassus had heeded the omens and acted cautiously? The history of Rome shows us that even the most powerful can fall, and that their mistakes can change the course of the world forever.